Hello everyone and welcome back to Whisky Wednesday. I'm back. We took a short break last week, mainly because January is very long and I had no money left. Didn't really have the opportunity to buy anything particularly interesting, so I thought I'd skip a week. Looking through sample drawers and everything and being like, pretty sure we've reviewed all of this to some degree. Or it's a really obscure single cask sample that's never going to be released, so what's the point? Anyway, I'm here today with a wonderful, underappreciated whiskey, which is Glengarry 12-year-old. Now, a brief history of Glengarry. One of the more unusual facts I have in whiskey is that it's the most easterly distillery in Scotland. There you go, fact of the day. But I've got a little history in front of me here. So, cut long story short, it's founded in 1797, and then, like most distilleries, up until about the 1960s, it went through numerous different ownerships. In 1968, it was decommissioned. In 1973, they restored production, and then in 1994, it was bought by Suntory, or Suntory took a majority control of Morrison Bowmore at that point. 1995, the distillery was mothballed, and then it reopened again in 1997, but they weren't using peated malt, it was just unpeated malt at this point. And then recently, in the last couple of years, there's been a couple of £1 million worth of investment into the distillery, and in 2021, they reopened their malting floor, which is pretty cool, because Bruichladdich are trying to do that as well. I think they've actually got planning permission to do it now, whereas Glengarry had 3 floors worth of malting to use. I don't know if they're using all 3 floors, but that can now provide the distillery with 25% of the grain it needs. So that's kind of fun. And another unusual fact about Glengarry is that they have I read this in a book the other day, because no one really talks about this distillery, but I'll get into that in a minute. They have a very unusual way to heat their wash still. It's a direct gas-fired wash still, which is a little bit unusual. And it does this thing called the Maillard process. It's spelt Maillard, but it's pronounced Maillard after a French scientist. And it essentially allows like leftover sugars and amino acids to kind of, for want of a better phrase, kind of caramelize and become a bit darker. And it just happens when things naturally start to brown in heat. I know you're thinking, most things do that if you apply heat, but specifically this thing is called the Maillard process, but it's spelled M-A-I-L-L-A-R-D. And Glengarry have this, and they want to use it to create a older Glengarry profile. Not older as in age, but older as in a more old-fashioned approach to things. And I just think it's a very fun distillery, and I haven't seen it for such a long time. I feel like the owners of this company, who I think is now Beam Suntory, they don't really talk about it. I've never seen it on an order form. It's one of those whiskies that belongs to Beam Suntory along with Edrington, even though they're kind of separate companies now in terms of distribution. But you see Macallan, you see Auchentoshan, you see Bowmore, you see Laphroaig, you see Maker's Mark and Jim Beam, and then you see Suntory. It's impossible not to, they're massive. But this just sits here, not really doing much. This 12-year-old is natural colour. It's non-chill filtered, and it's 48% alcohol as a standard offering. They do have a non-age stated entry-level product called a Founder's Reserve. I believe that is also 48%. Just doesn't come with an age on the front of it. I have got a sample of that somewhere, like a little miniature, but I haven't tried it for a long time. I got quite excited when I bought this. This cost me £50. Pretty good. And there's this nice kind of tweed look. It's not real tweed, but the box has got this nice kind of tweed vibe to it. There's some lovely pictures, if this will kindly focus, of the distillery and the people there, the old pictures. Based in a nice little village called Old Meldrum. And many, many years ago, they used to release single vintages. They did a 1995 vintage, so last vintage before they shut down for essentially a year. Incredible whiskey. If I could get my hands on one of those now for reasonable money, would absolutely buy again. Fully bourbon cask matured, it was like 54%, and it had this coconutty smoke. Just incredible. It's exceptional whiskey. But last week, or 2 weeks ago at this point, we talked about the falling of a giant in Lagavulin 16, and here I kind of feel that we have what could possibly be a very, very interesting whiskey. Well, I know it's an interesting whiskey. I've been enjoying a fair chunk of it, and from what I remember in the past. But nothing's really done with it. The ownership don't really talk about it. Retailers have it, but it's not something which is shouted about or even really talked about. Now, Glengarry, spelled Garioch, but pronounced Gary. Most people can access it in independent bottlers, and recently, I think Signatory, along with Black Bull and a few other people, not Black Bull, sorry, Signatory and Duncan Taylor, who own Black Bull, you can always see like second or third refill Glengarry single barrels. Sometimes they're finished in sherry octaves in their octave series, specifically with Duncan Taylor. And they're nice, they're quite cool examples, they're cash strength, they're rare, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think anyone really knows what the house characteristic of Glengarry is, and it's this heavier, bigger, don't want to use the word because we think of another distillery when we say it, but waxy profile. They have a distillation run of about 6 hours, which is particularly long. It's normally about 3. But again, that's to aid this older, heavier profile. Nonetheless, here it is in the glass. Poured myself a pretty heavy pour. Very quiet day in work today. And I'm just going to put this bottle to one side. I'm going to smell this. I don't think I've mentioned it, but it is a combination of bourbon and sherry. I couldn't find an exact percentage. And indeed on the nose, it's been sat there for about 15 minutes. It is the embodiment of, screwing up my notes, it is the embodiment of a Highland style. The use of this bourbon and sherry thing, the bourbon is providing these peachy, pineapple-y, exotic and stone fruit notes, whereas the sherry is filling in gaps that, as much as I love them, bourbon casks do tend to leave with richness. They're very fruity, they're very syrupy. They can be rich with like vanilla and things like that. But the sherry seems to be filling in all the blanks that the bourbon isn't quite getting to. It's some classic notes of like raisin. There's a very soft like powdered sugar note. And there's even some nutty stuff like hazelnut and pecan. There's even a little bit of maple syrup. I mean, it looks like maple syrup. And there's still, for me, what is a very distinctive Highland whiskey characteristic, which is this little bit of pepperiness. Just runs through everything. I think about pepperiness in Highland whiskies. You don't really get it so much with the ones that run down the middle, so things like Glengoyne, Deanston, maybe a little bit with Blair Athol, definitely not with Aberfeldy, certainly not with, always with some Edredour you can, but it's more the ones that kind of branch out around the coasts. So, you know, my mind instantly jumps to Old Pulteney, Clynelish. Those two also have like a saltiness, a smokiness to them. You've got things like, I mean, now Ardnamurchan, which I do get as this kind of black peppery sort of whiskey. Royal Brackler, for all of its lightness, does have this nice kind of rich pepperiness to it. I'm missing out loads of big ones. Glen Ord, if you can find good independent Glen Ord, it's always got this kind of apple black pepper thing to it. And then there's like a really obvious one that I'm missing, and it's on, Loch Lomond. Loch Lomond too always has this really nice sweet yet earthiness to it. And that's always like vanilla, ginger, honey, black pepper. There's always loads of really fun things in Loch Lomond. And this has all of it too, but with exotic and fruity notes, and with classic sherry notes too. There's even like a tiny bit of very dark chocolate. I'm not going to give people an exact percentage, but just dark chocolate. Let's taste it. It tastes like a classic Highland. That is my first whiskey of the day. And the 48% is very much making itself known. This is not a quiet product at all. And when we talk about this Glengarry character, I am having to cast my mind back quite a bit to remember when I got to try the Founders Reserve against the 12, against some vintages they released. They had like we mentioned a 95 vintage, they had a 1970, they've had a couple of 1978 vintages. Got to try a 1991 cash strength Hunter Lang release a few years ago, and that was outrageous. And it is full of this heavy, oily character. Like the finish on this thing is monstrous. Not in the sense of it's like attacking you, but it lingers and it's full. I taste more bourbon than I taste sherry, but I like that. Again, the sherry is just assisting with viscosity and intensity. The opening part of the palate is, if you like Clynelish, and we talk about the Clynelish 14 of years gone by, where it was like classic Clynelish, buy a bottle of this. It's probably the same price. It's higher alcohol. It's slightly more interesting. Clynelish is still interesting, but we've all talked about the Clynelish brewer thing for ages now, and this is just something a little bit different. It is full of these lemony orange oil, lemon orange skin, that pith, that rind. It's slightly bitter on the arrival. Reminds me almost of like vermouth. Big, loads of spice, very upfront with almost a botanical feel to it. And then as you kind of move it around your palate, the spice comes in from one side and the bourbon and the sherry comes in from other. I love on the label it just says there's a hint of oak, which is very much true because it's only a 12-year-old, but it is high ABV. It's natural colour. We're probably talking some decent first fill casks with that colour. And there is just a hint of it. There's a moderate dryness just lingering around my mouth now. I've been talking for about a minute too and I can still taste it. So again, a lot of good character in this. Let's try again. Squeaky chair. The second sip is, you have the spiciness and this fun interplay with casks, but you also have these beautiful dessert notes. I think it does say creme brulee on the label, but there is this warm, caramelised, custardy thing to it. Quite a fair bit of vanilla on the second sip. And then things like sticky toffee pudding, like warm sponge pudding with like a really sticky, sweet toffee sauce. But then again, that is counteracted by this fragrant, lemony black pepper. It's lovely. It's really good. Why don't we talk more about this? Whisky YouTube people, do you have this? Do you have an independent version? Have you got the standard version? Have you got the 12? Do you have one of those 1995 vintages, and can I buy it from you for reasonable money? Because this distillery is outrageous, and in theory, this is my theory, so you don't have to go read this anywhere. Despite the reopening of the floor maltings, and despite a couple of million investment from either Beam Suntory or Edrington, whoever owns this, I think it's Beam Suntory who own this, sell it. Give this to someone else. Probably not Billy Walker, because we know that we've only got a couple of years left of Billy's reign. That sounds really foreboding. He's not going to die. It's just he said he would retire when he bottles his own distillate at Glengarry. So I think we've got like 5 or 6 years left of that. Probably 5. Someone like Aaron should buy this place and just bottle everything. I don't know if the people from Aaron watch these videos. They probably don't. But the ownership of this distillery in the hands of an independent company is very useful, because if you think about the things that Beam Suntory owns, this probably has international viewers. Does this have a strong presence in travel retail? Because I know they used to have, it was either a 14 or a 15 in travel retail. If it does, maybe that's where they're putting all of it, because it is available in the UK, but it just isn't something that is sang about, which at this point isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for you people who want fun whiskey, you should probably buy some of this. I can't think what Beam Suntory would use it for, because Glenturret, which as a single malt is now owned by Lalique Crystal, that's hard to say, Lalique Crystal, Edrington still own the rights to Famous Grouse, and this isn't being used in Famous Grouse, so as far as I'm aware it isn't. I don't think they own many other blends, certainly not a Beam Suntory. Feel free to correct me. So what is this being used for? Is it just a place that distills whiskey and then a couple of cool vintages released and then the casks are traded for other stuff? Maybe? I don't know. But, yeah. Why is it not being utilised more? Because it's a fantastic distillery and it's significantly more interesting than Auchentoshan. Scoring. This is hard because I can't think of many of the £50 bottles of whiskey which I like this much, because I really like this. And the nose is just becoming like more peachy and apricotty as it leaves there. Obviously it's going to be a good score. But how high do I put it? Because as a single malt goes, apart from all the stuff that gets mentioned at like the Oswers and all that kind of thing, because happy to be involved in happy to be involved with the involvement of the Oswers. I've never put this whiskey in it, and I don't think anyone else has either. It's not a 9.5, because it's really good, but it's not mind-blowing whiskey, but it is high quality. So I think I'm going to give it a 9. Glengarry 12, because they don't have anything older than this either, apart from really obscure vintages and single casks releases from themselves and independent bottlers. But overall, I'm going to give it a 9. It's delicious. I'm falling out of love with sherry whiskey quite quickly again. This happens every year, and I start to drink it again around sort of autumn time, but it tends to be peated too. This is hitting all the right notes I want for big, bold, spicy, sweet Highland whiskey, which isn't like a Ben Romack single barrel, or isn't something from Ardnamurchan with a bit of peat in it, or even stuff from like Craigellachie, like those Craigellachie single casks, which are always like really meaty and sulphury. Delicious. 9 out of 10. You heard it from me. Other people have probably reviewed this, I just haven't seen it for a long time. But thank you all for watching. Yeah, if you like big, bold, waxy, spicy, interesting whiskies, Glengarry 12 is the way for you to go. Thank you all for watching. I will see you all next week, and have a wonderful time. Cheers.